to go. So today's LAMFcast lecture is entitled This is America, and it relates to the Lakes Area Music Festival's season opening concerts, American Roots, which will take place on July 31st and August 1st. And today we are joined by lecturer Garrett McQueen, who is a podcast host, musician, and amazing thinker on Western classical music. We are honored to have him as the newest member of our artistic advisors, and you may remember him from the beautifully curated concert for Wind Quintet, Seasons of Change, this past spring. So please welcome Garrett and enjoy the lecture.
Hello, and thank you so much for that introduction, Taylor. I love the your air quotes for Western classical music, because that actually touches on a little bit of what I'm going to be presenting today. So thank you, everyone, for being here, for watching. Shout out to Tim and Barb calling in from Wisconsin. I actually drove over to Wisconsin yesterday to get some fireworks for tomorrow's holiday. So really glad that you could be here live, and thanks to everyone who is watching this presentation. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and my sound, and we'll get started. So the title of today's presentation is This is America. This presentation is in conjunction with the American Roots concert that's taken place on July 31st and August 1st. It's really great for me to be here and to present this with you today. So these are some of the things we're going to talk about and cover today for this presentation. First and foremost, we're going to take a more peripheral look at Dvorak's Ninth Symphony. The concert actually ends on the 31st and the 1st with Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, his New World Symphony, as some folks may know. We're going to go backwards in program order and start with Dvorak's Ninth Symphony and take a more peripheral look, just sort of look at the circumstances and the many events and the many people who made that piece of music possible. We're going to broaden the definition of American through the music of Jimmy Lopez Prieto, his work called Techno, a movement from a larger work of his titled Fiesta, is going to be on the program, and really examining his music, the sounds therein, and the conversations surrounding it is a really great way for us to think about that word American, a word that we may use all the time, but one that we may take for granted as far as the different contexts in which it can exist. We're going to contextualize America's national anthems, a very special attention to the S at the end of anthems. We're going to take a look at that in relation to Jesse Montgomery's banner, which was inspired in part by the Star-Spangled Banner and some of the many national anthems of the world, and really looking at some past controversy concerning not only the American national anthem, but another one as well as it relates to that conversation. We're going to imagine future sounds through contemporary aesthetics as delivered by composer Mason Bates. If you're not familiar with the music of Mason Bates, I have to tell you, you're really in for a treat for this concert on the 31st and 1st to open up with some of his music. Mason Bates definitely thinks outside of the box. I often say there isn't even a box when it comes to the music of Mason Bates. So I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit about that. And then in closing, we'll consider the modern implications of an American orchestra and what it means to exist as an American orchestra celebrating American music. So up first in today's conversation is Antonin Dvorak. So just a few facts about him. Dvorak arrived in the United States in September of 1892 to help establish an American school of music, establish an American sound to Western classical music. The New World Symphony came shortly after his arrival. Dvorak actually started working on it in December of 1892, and it was completed in May of 1893. Now, Dvorak and his family, as you can imagine they were far away from home, where they were from in Bohemia. So as anyone would, the homesickness began to set in. Dvorak and his family wanted to speak their native language, eat some of their native food, even drink some of their native beer, as history tells. So to do that, the family traveled to Spillville, Iowa, not far from where I am right now here in St. Paul, in the summer of 1893. That's where they spent that summer, and where many other pieces were born. And then in December of 1893, the family returned to New York, where the New World Symphony premiered in Carnegie Hall to critical acclaim. And to this day, it is still one of the most celebrated works in all of the classical music repertoire. Dvorak's other symphonies definitely get plenty of attention. I personally love his Eighth Symphony, but there's no denying the importance and the significance of Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, especially when you consider its connection to America, the United States. There's a quote that I often pull up in relation to Antonin Dvorak, concerning what he discovered when he came here to the United States. And I thought I would bring in the extended quote today, in case you're already familiar. Antonin Dvorak once says, as you can see on your screen, "In the Negro melodies of America, I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. They are pathetic, tender, passionate, melancholy, solemn, religious, bold, merry, gay, or what you will. It is music that suits itself to any mood or any purpose. There is nothing in the whole age of composition that cannot be supplied with themes from this source." I think it's really important to extend that quote and really go into what Dvorak was saying about the passionate, the solemn, religious, merry, because we often think of that Negro spiritual, what Dvorak was referring to here as the Negro melodies, as music that's very downtrodden and rooted in oppression and sadness and even servitude. While that is a very important aspect of what we call today the spiritual or the Negro spiritual, it's so much more. And Antonin Dvorak, really affirming this, laid the groundwork for just about all American music that would come before it. Now, it's very important to remember and to think about why and how Antonin Dvorak came here to the United States. A woman's name who I make sure to always say in conjunction with this story is the name of the woman pictured here, Jeanette Thurber. She established the National Conservatory of Music of America in 1885. She grew up in a relatively wealthy household with folks who were very much interested in philanthropy. And with her interest being in music, that's where she pointed a lot of her energy. She radically advocated for women, Black people, and those living with different abilities when it came to her music school. It's very important to remember that in the late 19th century and all the way up into even early parts of the 20th century, music school and the study of music, the study of the academic study of most things, was an activity specifically and exclusively for white men. Well, Jeanette Thurber challenged this. She wanted to see way more diversity, not only in music schools, but in music in general. And this was her way of doing that, actively pushing for change, being something that we're still doing today, and something that Jeanette Thurber set in motion so many years ago, over 100 years ago. Jeanette Thurber recognized Dvorak's ability to paint a national picture with music, which ultimately inspired her to invite him to the United States, which would give birth to the New World Symphony and so many other pieces of music. Dvorak is noted among many other composers, again, with the ability to just paint a picture of a people, of a nation through his music. You see that throughout his catalog when it comes to bohemian sounds and bohemian aesthetics. Well, his reputation to do that became global shortly after one of his first chamber works. And it got the attention of Jeanette Thurber, and that's how Antonin Dvorak came to the United States in the first place. So when you think about Dvorak's New World Symphony, and you think about the story of him coming to this new place and being inspired by Black music and other things when he composed this composition, his most famous composition, be sure to always remember the name Jeanette Thurber, because if it wasn't for her, we may not even have the piece of music. And there's another very, very, very important name when it comes to the story of Antonin Dvorak, Jeanette Thurber, and the New World Symphony. That's the name of Harry Thacker Burleigh, or Henry Thacker Burleigh. He's pictured there on your screen. Mr. Burleigh's grandfather was born a slave, and he bought his freedom and his wife's freedom for $55. His freedom cost $50, and the freedom of his wife cost $5. Now, why is this important? I think it's really important to bring this up and always remember this when it comes to Harry Thacker Burleigh, because he would go on to keep one of the musical traditions alive that many people were trying to forget about. Remember when we talked about Dvorak's affirmation of the Negro spiritual being so much more than just sadness and sorrow and oppression. That was the idea that was held around that music for much of Henry Thacker Burleigh's life. So a big part of his work, and one of the reasons we remember him, is because he kept the tradition of Negro spirituals alive as a musician and as an arranger and composer. Harry Thacker Burleigh was a beautiful baritone, and when he wasn't singing those spirituals, he was arranging them or translating them, as I noted there, into a more Western frame. He put them on scores, on sheet music, so for people to play on the piano, to sing, and to really pass along the tradition, for ages to come. You'll often hear Henry Thacker Burleigh referred to as the father of the spiritual. He served as a mentor to Antonin Dvorak when he came here. So Jeanette Thurber had him over. Dvorak was connected with Henry Thacker Burleigh, and it is from Burleigh that Dvorak learned some of the musical history of the United States, what the spiritual was, why it's important to understand the spiritual when it comes to thinking about American music. And Henry Thacker Burleigh even introduced Dvorak to many other students. One of the students of Dvorak, introduced to him by Burleigh, would go on to be the mentor of Duke Ellington, who is, of course, a monumental American composer and musician. So again, when we think about Dvorak's New World Symphony, we have to think about not only Dvorak, but Jeanette Thurber and also Henry Thacker Burleigh, two people who were integral in Dvorak's time in the United States and the composition of not only the New World Symphony, but many compositions by Dvorak. There's one more name that I think is very important to note when it comes to the story of the Ninth Symphony, and that is of William Arms Fisher. So the second movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony is highlighted by a melody that we now know as Going Home. It's been described as soulful. It's been described as Dvorak's way of singing or writing through an American voice, an American musical perspective, his missing home, his wishing to be back among his people, his family, his food, his beer, and the other things that I have mentioned. So he wrote that beautiful melody into that second movement, and his then student, William Arms Fisher, wrote the lyrics that we now know of Going Home when we sing the song. So there's been a lot of discussion over the years as far as where this song came from. Is it based on a spiritual? Did someone else write it? Where the scholarship sits right now, and the scholarship that I tend to agree with, is that through everything Dvorak was learning from Henry Thacker Burleigh and the many other musicians and individuals he was coming into contact with, those feelings and that spirit, that flavor went into that beautiful melody that William Arms Fisher would eventually write lyrics to. He's quoted here as saying, "The Largo," and that's from the New World Symphony, "the Largo, with its haunting English horn solo, is the outpouring of Dvorak's own home longing with something of the loneliness of far-off prairie horizons, the faint memory of the red man's bygone days, and a sense of the tragedy of the Black man as it sings in his spirituals. Deeper still, it is a moving expression of that nostalgia of the soul all human beings feel. That the lyric opening theme of the Largo should spontaneously suggest the words going home is natural enough, and that the lines that follow the melody should take the form of a Negro spiritual, of course, with the genesis of the symphony. I will note that there is language, of course, in this quote that is much outdated, language that may have even been outdated in those days. But I think it's important to note because indigenous sounds, Black sounds, and the Western European construct frame of this symphony, specifically of this second movement of the symphony, were things that the composer and folks around the composer, and I would even say audience members, would always understand. When they heard that, when they heard this American-inspired music of Dvorak, they heard all of these things. And William Arns Fisher, in writing lyrics to that famous melody, affirmed all of those things. The composition Going Home as a song has been performed by many people over the years, some famous, some not. But as an example today, I thought I would share just the opening phrase of Going Home as performed by the late, great Paul Robeson. Of course, when you hear this in context of the symphony, is brought to you by the English horn, but I think the lyrics are really important to hear. So we're going to listen to Paul Robeson sing the opening of this song version of Going Home, lyrics written by William Arms Fisher.
It's not far, just close by, through an open door.
And I encourage you to definitely check out the rest of that on your own time and other performances of Going Home, so that when you hear the solo and the English horn in context in the second movement of this symphony, you can really get a sense of what Dvorak must have been feeling. Not only that, but the many things and the many people that inspired not only that movement, but the entire performance. Rest in peace, of course, to the late Paul Robeson. If every now and again I come across folks who have never heard his name. So if you don't know the name Paul Robeson, I won't talk about him today, but definitely do some reading about Paul Robeson, a very important figure when it comes to the formation of what we call American music, even American classical music. So moving on to the next piece on the concert, the penultimate piece that you'll hear on this July 31st, August 1st performance is music of Jimmy Lopez Bellido. He's considered one of the most interesting young composers anywhere today. That's from the Chicago Sun, an expert in orchestration from the New York Times, and adventurous and winning by the Denver Post. Jimmy was born in Lima down in Peru. And as you can see, he has really made waves across the globe, just spreading his music everywhere, not only making global appearances at concerts, but also conferences. Something that I recently learned about this composer is that we actually crossed paths a few years ago at the annual Sphinx conference in Detroit. If you're unfamiliar with Sphinx, it's an organization built to highlight Black and Latina musicians and composers in the art form. Something that he talked about in a recent interview with a man named Christian Baldini is the importance of institutions like that when it comes to this music. the leader of Sphinx, Anton Dvorak, and often is quoted as saying their goal is for Sphinx to not be needed in the ecosystem. Well, we're not quite there yet. And Jimmy really participating and playing a role in that conference is just one of the many things that he does to really expand audiences' view, our view of what we think about when we hear the phrase American music or American classical music. The Americas are quite broad, are quite diverse and dynamic. And Jimmy definitely brings his own flavor to that idea through all of his many compositions, not only in a traditional way, in a way that's traditional to the aesthetics of Peru, but really contemporary and forward-leaning American music as well. One of the things that you can hear in the music of this composer, Jimmy Lopez Bellido, is some of those traditional sounds. Pictured here on your screen is an instrument called the charango. It kind of looks like a ukulele to my eyes, but it's often described as a lute type instrument, and it's often used in their music and in much of their dance music especially, and is really grounding not only in the most traditional, but even some more contemporary works. There's a composer, another living composer by the name of Celso Garrido Lecca. He's still living, last I checked. I think he's 95 years old. And while he's still writing traditional, or rather contemporary music, he always has one hand on that tradition, and especially the sound of the charango. So I brought in just an excerpt of one of his pieces, and if you listen closely, you'll be able to hear the strumming of that instrument toward the end of this short excerpt. Yeah, so if you listened really, I love that piece. If you listen really carefully toward the end there, you heard the charango really being used there, strummed there. We listen to that. I think it's important to have that sound in your ear as you approach the music of Jimmy Lopez Bellido, because there are some aspects of that traditional sound, those really traditional aspects, but placed in a really new way, and in a way that really speaks to the moment and what, again, American music in its most broad sense can mean in today's ecosystem. The piece itself that's on the concert is the final movement of a work of his called Fiesta. It's the movement is subtitled Techno. And I actually found some of his own program notes here, so I'll read them for you. It says, during recent years, eclecticism has become an important part of my musical language. The challenge of creating musically sensible interactions out of the juxtaposition of apparently incomparable musical sources, some of which result in unexpected contrast, really fascinates me. Again, what I'm speaking to when it comes to putting some of that really traditional and that really new right on top of each other for audiences to enjoy. Fiesta draws influences from several musical sources, including European academic compositional techniques. So we're talking about just the nuts and bolts of writing a melody, writing a harmony, putting it on staff paper, and translating it in a similar way that Thacker did so many years ago. He also speaks to Latin American music, some of those tradition, Afro-Peruvian music, shouting out the African and the Black influence on his work, plus today's pop music. Even in the word techno and that subtitle techno, you can use your imagination and just sort of think in your mind what it must sound like. I won't give any of it away today, but it's a really, really phenomenal piece that I can't wait for each and every one of you to enjoy. He closes here by saying it utilizes elaborate developmental techniques while keeping the primeval driving forces still latent in popular culture. I think that's a very important point to understand, really diving into all of these compositional techniques and showing off your abilities is one thing, but Jimmy really pays attention to targeting today's audiences, targeting the folks that go to concerts today, maybe even the younger set. And you'll definitely be able to hear much of that influence in this piece of music as well. Looking forward to for you to hear that later this month. So up next, we have music of Jesse Montgomery. Jesse Montgomery is a composer who is really blowing up these days, to say the least. My first interactions with Jesse Montgomery also happened at the Sphinx annual conference and other gatherings. I consider Jesse a personal friend of mine, and it's always a pleasure for our paths to cross. One of her earlier explorations was her participation with the Catalyst Quartet. Jesse is no longer a member of the Catalyst Quartet, but still composes for the Catalyst Quartet and does work well outside of the chamber ecosystem as well. She's, I mentioned our connections to Sphinx. Jesse Montgomery is a Sphinx awardee in many capacities, a former musician with the ensemble Sphinx Virtuosi, a Sphinx Medal of Honor recipient, and many other honors. She's a very, very, very decorated composer. And currently, as it was announced about 2 months ago, Jesse Montgomery is the new composer in residence for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. So we're going to be hearing a lot from Jesse Montgomery on a platform as huge as the Chicago Symphony. She has a really great quote that I included on the screen here. She says, "Music is my connection to the world. It guides me, to understand my place in relation to others and challenges me to make clear the things I do not understand. I imagine that music is a meeting place at which all people can converse about their unique differences and common stories." This is really important to note, I think, when it comes to the piece of music that's on this concert by her called Banner, because there are a lot of differences that can be explored through that piece of music, and yet common stories can still come out of it all. Before I talk more about Banner, I think we have to go back and take a second look, maybe a third look at the American national anthem. Banner is in part inspired by it. And one of the things that Jesse Montgomery really stresses is that it's about a national anthem for today's more diverse society than it was when Francis Scott Key wrote those lyrics so long ago. We all know, or maybe most of us are familiar with the first verse of the anthem, but it actually has more verses. And in recent years, people have been returning to this third verse to sort of contextualize it in today's for today's people. It says the lines that most people have an issue with is, "No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, and the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." What does it mean to celebrate a piece of music that speaks to a past that we sort of look at in a really dark way, as we should? That's one of the things that Jesse Montgomery explores in this piece of music. And as I mentioned, it's not only the American national anthem that has inspired this piece, but national anthems around the world. This sort of controversy of the question surrounding national anthems isn't unique to the United States either, which is a very important thing to note. One of the world's national anthems, the national anthem of Japan, titled Kimi ga yo, has similar stories and conversations surrounding it. The man in the top of the screen, John Williams Fitton, he is noted as one of Japan's first bandmasters. He went over there as a military general and infused his view of his Western view of music on their society, all the way to writing the Japanese national anthem. That is something that many people don't know. The Japanese the melody anyway, to the Japanese national anthem was not written by anyone from Japan, but actually a Westerner. That original melody was eventually trashed and changed to something that the emperor and the governing bodies in Japan found a little more pleasing to the ears. But the harmonies of that national anthem still have that Western influence. The other man pictured on the screen, composer Franz Eckert, is credited with writing the harmony to the Japanese national anthem, now known as Kimi Gayo. In a similar way to that third movement of the American national anthem being something that people look back on and sort of question sometimes, it's the same thing with Kimi Gayo. Again, just to point out the fact that the things that Jessie Montgomery explores when she wrote the piece Banner, a national anthem, an anthem for today's more diverse society. I think it's only fair to name other examples of how these questions sort of come as it relates to other national anthems. I thought we would listen here. It's a very short anthem, and as you listen, I think you'll be able to hear the Eastern dialect of the melody on top of that very, very Western harmonization as written by Franz Eckert. Performing Kimi Gayo here is a joint performance, the Detroit Youth Orchestra and the Toyota City Junior Orchestra. So ending and beginning in that very, or slightly maybe even Eastern aesthetic, with the middle really being rooted in those Western harmonies. So again, we have to look at the past and understand how the past of certain national anthems have implications in today's society to really understand what Jessie Montgomery was going for when she wrote Banner. I'll add on a personal note, aside from my study of music over the years, my secondary study has always been Japan, Japanese culture and the Japanese language. So while there is some controversy still to this day in Japan when it comes to Kimi Gayo, I think the melody and even the lyrics are really beautiful. I'll try to think of some. Isho ni yashiyomi sazare ishi no iwa oto yamite, which basically means, may the reign of the emperor last until small stones become heavy boulders. So as we look to the future, I think we can really use that as a jumping off point, really, despite past complications, I'll say, when it comes to certain parts of our history, leaning forward and looking forward to not only a brighter future, but a bigger future, as it's literally stated in this national anthem. And of course, one of the other very, very, very important pieces of music to note as an inspiration of Jessie Montgomery's Banner is Lift Every Voice. It was written back in the early 20th century, I believe the year 1900 or 1901, by brothers J. Roseman Johnson and James Weldon Johnson. Many folks often refer to it as the Negro national anthem. You'll sometimes hear that. A song used by many Black folks, including myself, to not only honor America, but honor Afro-America and the many struggles and the bright future that lies ahead. When we think about some of the lyrics again to that third verse of the American national anthem, you may be able to understand why Lift Every Voice has really become an anthem, not only for Afro-Americans, but for all of America, for all of us to fight on, facing the rising sun, as the lyrics say, hoping for that and fighting for that better future. We won't listen to all of Lift Every Voice today, but thanks to the Schubert Club, I was able to present a bassoon demonstration in which I started with Lift Every Voice. So we'll listen to my rendition of the opening line to Lift Every Voice. I really love that song. I really love that song. It's a very important song to me, and a very important song to Jessie Montgomery as well, in addition to the Star Spangled Banner and the many other world anthems that inspired her composition, Banner. As you can see here, it was commissioned by the Sphinx organization in tribute for the 200th anniversary of the Star Spangled Banner, drawing on musical and historical sources from various world anthems and patriotic songs. Jessie says, what does an anthem for the 21st century sound like in today's multicultural environment? I think that's a question that we all should ask ourselves, not only when it comes to this piece of music, but in general. What does the future of an American national anthem look like? If it is ever changed or altered as it has been in other parts of the world, what should it be? What should it sound like? In what ways could that represent more of what America is? All questions that Jessie Montgomery considered in writing this piece of music, and questions that I hope you'll consider as well as you enjoy this piece of music. And getting toward the end of today's presentation, but the beginning of the concert on July 31st is the music of Mason Bates. Mason Bates is a Grammy winner. He actually wrote music for the world's first ever YouTube symphony orchestra way back when, maybe not way back when, I think the year was 2005, premiering a work called Mothership. If you don't know that piece of music, I definitely encourage you to Google that. We will listen to a little bit of another one of the compositions of Mason Bates, but in my experience, Mothership is definitely the most famous, if not among the more famous. I've had the opportunity to perform Mothership a few times. I've seen it in concert, so definitely check out Mothership. I won't even give anything away, but it's definitely a very, very, very forward and very forward-thinking piece of music, and a very fun piece of music. Mason Bates also contextualizes America in a very important way. Again, when we think about that idea of American music, the American sound that Dvorak worked to codify so long ago, the American sound that folks who live outside of the United States draw on for inspiration, he really contextualizes all of those things, moving all the way even back to indigenous America, the cultures of Native Americans. I couldn't put it in the slide here, but I did want for us to listen to a little bit of an example of that. Again, when we think about Mason Bates, it's important to think about his very broad view of what that American sound is. He has a piece of music called Desert Transport, and it's basically about Mason Bates flying in a helicopter, taking a helicopter ride with a good friend of his, actually a conductor by the name of Bob Moody. He's the music director of the Memphis Symphony Orchestra down in Tennessee. So they're great friends. They were taking a helicopter ride across the desert, and that helicopter ride eventually manifested in a piece of music inspired by it. And as you listen here to this very short excerpt, you can hear Mason Bates' perspective of traveling over indigenous reservations, indigenous lands, and incorporating those sounds into this piece of music, highlighting what is ultimately most American about America. We'll take a listen here. It really is such an incredible piece of music by this very important American composer. Again, when we think about Mason Bates, we have to consider his very broad and even historical view of what America is. All of that plays a role in his music. And while you may not hear those specific Shaker songs, those indigenous Shaker songs in the piece of music that's opening this July 31st, August 1st concert, is very important, once again, to just always keep in mind that Mason Bates is one of those composers who has always really centered America and American music in a very, very unique and unapologetic way. The piece of music of his that opens this concert is titled Attack, Decay, Sustain, and Release. And if you search that on the internet, you'll find this really interesting graphic that actually lays that out, that idea of initiating sound, decaying the sound, sustaining what you have, and finally leaving it and bringing it all into the ether when it comes to closing out a piece of music. It's been described, it's described in the program notes as a quick and energetic opener filled with lopsided grooves and coy asides. This fanfare was commissioned and premiered by the San Francisco Symphony under Michael Tilson Thomas. That description as lopsided grooves and coy asides immediately makes me think of another very American and very common concert opener that I'm sure many of you know, Bernstein's Overture to Candide. I think when you hear this piece of music on the concert, you'll be reminded of just that fun, that whimsical sound, that not taking oneself too seriously, that has highlighted so much of American music, American classical music, and especially American classical music concert openers. I think it's the perfect pick for this concert and a work that you are sure to enjoy without a doubt. So when we come to the end of this presentation, one of the things that I think about a lot in my work and that I encourage you to think about when it comes to this concert in particular is the idea of decolonizing American orchestras, the American arts institution. Again, when Dvorak came here so long ago on invitation by Jeanette Thurber and inspired by Henry Thacker Burleigh, he wasn't here to spread the joys of the the Polish mazurka or the any of the Czech dances or any of those European-centered aesthetics. He was really trying to build something new, and he affirmed that we had all we needed to do just that. As history shows, maybe even as the present shows, if you look at most concert programs, it doesn't really have that American centric feel or that American centered approach or perspective. Whose music do we usually center as we look at this diverse program of American men, American women, and even a South American man? We have to ask ourselves, why does this concert look different? Who do we usually center? And why are we usually centering those things? Why do programs like these not typically exist? Why is it always sort of a special thing? Questions that we have to ask ourselves when we really consider the culture that we sustain when it comes around the American concert hall. Does this program represent any other place than America? I think that's also a very important point to consider. When we perform and listen to symphonies of Beethoven or Brahms or insert your top tier historic composer, Rachmaninoff, even Stravinsky. Those are sounds that may have been inspired in part by the United States sometimes, especially when you talk about Stravinsky. But for the most part, culturally, that music speaks to a culture that is grounded somewhere in Europe. This program that the Lakes Area Music Festival is presenting is a real view of America. This is America. This is what's exclusively America, and this is what we could really offer to the world through our concert halls. We have to push institutions, not only performance institutions, but schools, and our private music teachers and everyone who has a hand, who has a role in maintaining classical music, Western classical music here in the United States. We have to push for more institutions to celebrate America in the way that this program does. One of the results, I think, is a more diverse audience, maybe even a younger audience, and ultimately an audience that has a true perspective of what it means to be an American in the ecosystem of music, what an American arts institution is, and what an American sound is, something that Dvorak sought out to codify so long ago, something that I think today that we're still struggling to really codify and come to grips with as American arts institutions, but it's something that, as we can see by this concert program, is definitely not outside of reach. That concludes my portion of the program today. I'm going to go over here to the questions. I think I see a couple questions. And the first one is, how do you think the meaning of music changes when it is moved from the oral tradition, African-American spirituals, Peruvian music, etc., to Western classical notation? What is lost and what is gained? I think that's an extremely excellent question, and a question that I've actually been exploring on my own time. The next, I'll shamelessly plug the next guest on my podcast for next week. I feature a conversation with a composer whose name is Garrett. He's an indigenous composer. He has a background in the Chickasaw Nation and highlights much of that American music, that American aesthetic in his composition. I bring him up because it's actually a question that I ask him, and his answer, I'll echo as best as I can. He believes that when you get it down to the notation, there's always going to be things that are limiting about it. But if we really center the musician, the person making the music, and work on that sort of communication, having the privilege of having these composers that are actually here and not dead plays a huge role in making sure that things aren't lost. I will never deny the fact that there are some things lost when you put a spiritual specifically on the page. Even in the way that I performed the opening theme to Lift Every Voice a few minutes ago, not all of those things can really be translated on the page, but that requires that communication, that study, and really being among the people in whatever way you can. Dvorak didn't write America-inspired music, his New World Symphony from Bohemia, from what is now the Czech Republic. He came here to understand the people and to understand the culture so that he could best translate what he heard and what he experienced on the page. So I think that's just a very important aspect. There are always things lost because there will always be limitations to writing music down on the page. But at the same time, with those conversations and with those real life interactions, or even the study of these people, if they're no longer here, I think some of that, some of what is lost can be regained, especially through performance. And then the second question I have here, when you think of the broad term American music, are there other universal through lines that set it apart from other musics? I think that's also a really incredible question. Something that I repeat in most of my presentations that I've said in some regard here already, I'll say again, with the exception of music codified by indigenous communities, indigenous cultures. There really is no music in the United States that is unique to the United States that doesn't branch from what Dvorak again described as those Negro melodies, those Negro spirituals. There are all sorts of pieces of music that were happening here in the United States during the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm thinking about McDowell. I'm forgetting his first name right now, but the man who wrote the first piano concerto here in the United States. Of course, we have the late great Amy Marcy Shaney Beach, the first woman in the United States to write a piano concerto, the first woman to write a symphony here in the United States. Now, that symphony is subtitled the Gaelic Symphony. So it's a symphony heavily inspired by the sounds and the cultures of particularly Scotland and Ireland and England. So while that is American music, it's not as deeply rooted in America as are the offshoots of that Negro spiritual, because the Negro spiritual didn't come from Africa. That wasn't music that was sung by Black folks before chattel slavery. That music was created. It grew up from the soil. Many folks know the name William Grant Still. His second symphony is subtitled Song of a New Race, as a means of saying these are new people. These are not African people. These are Afro-Americans. So that means this music is new. Now, when you consider the offshoots of the Negro spiritual, you have to consider country music. You know, before the race records of the early 20th century that began to split off genres, creating, giving way to the mostly white-dominated country music that we know today. Of course, we have to think about jazz and blues and gospel and bebop, even moving all the way up into hip hop, which has arguably become the dominant genre of the entire world. You can travel all around the globe, all the way in Asia, Africa, South America, and hear that beat, hear that hip hop influence. So when it comes to American music, I think what really sets it apart is its connection to the Negro spiritual. That doesn't mean that all American music or American music is only Black music. American music is so much more. But I think the bigger point to understand that anything that is purely and solely American and exists nowhere else in the world is music that has developed from that Negro spiritual. So when we add in the aesthetics of a Western orchestra as we know it, when we put a conductor there, when we put a score and sheet music into the mix, there's all sorts of things that are sort of mixed in and they influence each other, as is apparent in this very program. But basically, that's my basic answer to that question. When I think of a universal through line, I think about those Negro melodies. And again, if you go back in the writings of Dvorak, that's something that he affirmed. It's interesting to think about someone from Europe affirming the uniqueness and the importance of Black music when it comes to what is purely and exclusively American. And I'm going to check the chat just to make sure nothing else is here. Okay, well, great. So that concludes my presentation today. Again, you can get more information on this upcoming concert on the Lakes area webpage. This concert, American Roots, is taking place on August on July 31st, Saturday, and August 1st, Sunday. I'll actually be there to speak a little bit on the concert live and in person. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for taking the time today. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, and I hope that you enjoy this upcoming concert, American Roots. Huge thanks to both Taylor and Scott for having me, and until next time.